Welcome back to the lecture series in animal physiology. We are into week 4, lecture 5, week 4. Okay. So, let us start with lecture 5, the last lecture of 4th week. So, we talked about, now introduce few terminologies. So, that demands that we again revise them. We talked about dorsal pathway, ventral pathway. Dorsal means sensory pathway, which are bringing the information from all the peripherals or all different parts of the body, internal or external, to the central processing unit, which is the spinal cord or the brain, depending on the what kind of information is being relayed. If it is a very sophisticated information, visual information, that from here it will directly go to the brain via the spinal cord. Similarly, if it is coming from ear, exactly the same way through auditory nerves, and there are specific nerves involved which has different names given according to their processing or depending on their anatomical location. Now, having said this, there are certain informations I told you which are getting processed in the spinal cord itself. That means the sensory signal which is reaching the spinal cord has to be conveyed to the motor neurons which are sitting there. So, that is done by a class of neurons which are sitting, and I will put them in neurons which are conveying the message of the sensory neurons crosstalks with the motor neuron in the spinal cord via interneurons. And just for your knowledge sake, sometimes people write motor neurons as MOTONEURONS. So, do not get confused. These are different terminologies which are being used. So, there is something which is missing here. If you look at this picture carefully, you just see the motor neurons sitting here, but these motor neurons are fed information from the brain, from the very higher centers of the brain, and they travel like this. So, motor neurons itself are classified as 2 categories of motor neurons. We will come later while we will talk about diseases like Parkinson's and other movement related disorders where this problem can be seen very clearly. There are higher motor neurons, there are lower motor neurons. When we talk about higher motor neurons, we talk about, I told you, the higher structure or higher level of processing. So, motor neurons which are sitting out here, they convey the signal out here. This is how the circuit goes. Whereas, sensory neurons are again of that kind. Some of them sitting, they sit here, they have their target out here, and from here either they directly go to the brain or sometime they convey the message out here, and these ones carries the message to the brain. And in between we will talk a lot about another set of neurons which are kind of subtype of it, which is called sympathetic and parasympathetic, but I will not confuse you at this stage, we will come later into it. So, out here the information is going like this, and out here on the other side, ventral side, the information is moving out from this. Interestingly, if you look at a motor neuron, part of its cord is well extended away from the spinal cord all the way into your muscles, and that has its own anatomical, I should say anatomical modification. We will come later into it, but for the time being appreciate these terminologies: dorsal pathway, dorsal horn, ascending pathway and sensory pathway. These are all falls under the same category, whereas ventral pathway, ventral horn, descending or motor pathway, they all fall under the same line. Okay. Having said this, now we will move on to explain the basic anatomy of the neuron, which we haven't done yet. You all have seen, as of now I have drawn cells like this. Cell membrane, with a series of organelle inside it, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum. I am just put MT, ER, sarcoplasmic reticulum, GA, Golgi apparatus. You have the nucleus, and there are a series of lipid bodies called vacuoles and likewise, okay, or peroxisomes, vacuoles likewise. Okay. So, now when you talk about neurons, some of these cells which are destined to become neuron, they follow a different course, and the way these cells grow is very interesting. Suppose this cell is destined to become neuron, this is the nucleus. Okay. They first of all send out lot of processes around them like this. This is how the development occurs. Okay. Multiple processes. Multiple processes. Now, among these multiple processes, some interesting reason which till this date is not very clear. One of these processes dominates over others. That means, say for example, the multiple processes which are coming out like this, but imagine all these all my fingers are those multiple processes, but one of them decides to grow longer and the rest will not grow. So, in other words, they develop some form of polarity. There is a polarization of one process which grows up. What we do not know is, given this situation, if I number them like A, P1, P2 as process 1, process 2, process 3, all the way if I move, I will have Pn. So, for each one of these processes, if I measure the probability, each one of them have equal probability to grow either together or become the longer one. But how one of them, one chosen one, becomes the process and rest remain smaller one, we do not know. And this is one of the central problem of nervous system, who and how and what determines the polarization of the neuron. There are a lot of studies happening across the world for last possibly 25 to 30 years, but still to tell with absolute certainty is a real challenge. There are several very elegant studies, very complex studies, surface chemistry related studies, but as of now we really do not know this answer to this question. But for the time being, let us see what happens after this. So, one of the processes out here becomes longer like this, whereas the rest of them may form networks like this, but will not grow any further, and they form complex networks, and eventually at a point this structure kind of stop to grow. So, it is a continuous structure like this. So, this is the classic anatomy of a neuron, but that does not essentially means all the neurons are like that. But before I get into those complex stuff, these small processes which did not grow further, they all are termed as dendrite individually, dendrites, and this whole network what they form out here, the arborization is called dendritic arbor. Here you have the nucleus, and the process which is the chosen one is called axon, and this is the axonal terminal. This is from where the axon originated, is called axon hillock. Okay. And if you kind of take a 3D view of this, this is like a tube like this. This axon, and you almost see there are a lot of proteins which are laid almost like railroads. And what is the significance of it? Once we talk about Alzheimer's and Parkinson and all those other neurodegenerative diseases, we will talk about it as if they are lying together. And at this fag end out here, if you look at the axonal terminal, you will see lot of mitochondria have migrated all the way from the cell body. So, this part, nucleus and the surrounding structure, this constitute, let me just shade it for your convenience in yellow. So, this is the cell body of the neuron. Now, this is the classic architecture of a neuron. There are n number of variations into it. There are neurons who have very few dendritic arbors. There are neurons which do not have an axon. There are neurons where dendritic tree is more prominent than the axon. There are neurons where the dendritic arbor is so specialized that it is just amazing to look at, that the way it pick up signals, external signals. But at this stage, of course, I will just highlight that here the modification or deviation, modification and deviations from classic structure of neuron are many, and depending on context. Context wise, I will request you to remember this week 4 last class, that is the 5th lecture of the week 4. Depending on the context, we will time and again, we will pick up those modifications, because this is very, very important you understand it. Now, it is a polar structure. Polar structure. Now, in this polar structure, as I told you, there are information processing which happens. So, most of the information, again, at this stage we are not talking about how the information processing takes place, which most likelihood I will be starting in the next class, but at this stage you have to understand the basic anatomy before you understand the physiology, how the information processing happens. Now, the way it works is, you saw this whole dendritic arbor, right? This dendritic arbor picks up the information. So, in other words, all the informations are being picked up by this dendritic arbor. The one I am showing in the green are, imagine these are the informations. These informations will come later, do not worry about it, what does that mean? These informations through electrical processing is being conveyed through these axon to the next neuron. So, the next neuron starts here, where another neuron sitting whose dendritic arbor is out here. It's going to the next neuron, or even there is another neuron, imagine, sitting. So, in other words, what you observe is as if, to draw it, so you are seeing something very interesting, that so it seems like there it forms a wire, but unlike when we talk about electrical wires, we talk about continuous wire, but here the wire is not continuous, it is a discontinuous wire. Neuron convey this to the next, convey to the third, convey to the fourth. So, as a matter of fact, now look at your own body. If there is a neuronal terminal here, a dendritic terminal, it picks up the information, somewhere the said body is sitting there, it conveys the information all the way, it is traveling, and this is all the electrical impulses which are traveling all the way to the brain through breakpoints, through checkpoints. It is never a continuous thing. So, it means some way or other at different level, first of all, any information what we get, say for example, we get information of light. we get an information of pressure, we get an information of touch, we get an information of vibration, we get a thermal information. The step 1 of information processing, what we mentioned, you remember out here, the information processing. So, that what we talked in week 4, lecture 4. So, information processing could be divided into distinct mode. Say for example, you have, let us put all the informations first. Okay. Informations, say information of light, you have to visually, you have to see, touch, which is of course under pressure, sensors, you have thermal, what is the temperature, you have sound, which is vibrations. Okay. All these information, the first thing what has to happen is that, so now you have a sensory apparatus, right. All these modalities first of all has to be translated into an electrical signal. The first information translation. Informations, so these are all the physical forces, when they are physical in nature or even including say high pH or low pH, acidic or alkaline, alkaline or slash acidic. All this information has to be translated into electrical impulse. So, in the form of signal transduction or signal processing, this is what we call them as transformation, signal transformation, level 1 of transformation, first level of transformation. These electrical signals are then moved to the processing apparatus. The processing, as I mentioned you, could be at the spinal cord, which is the lower level of processing, or at the level of the brain, right. These electrical impulses have to travel to the processing unit. There is a in between, of course, while this electrical impulse is transmitted to the processing next level of apparatus, this is level 2 of processing, because from one system it is moving to the next system. So, this is a sensory system, this is pretty much is the motor system. Based on that, these processed information, I am just changing the color for your understanding sake, is brought back, which is for the execution at that specific point, level 3 of transfer of processed information. So, if you look at it very carefully, at different level there are different intensity of information processing of electrical information. So, that brings us to a point to understand how these electrical informations are being generated in these structures, and that brings us to another very interesting point which I have highlighted. Cells can be classified into two categories, excitable cell and non-excitable cells, right. So, excitable cells are the ones which could translate any information into electrical impulse, which essentially a muscle can do, and by autorhythmicity cardiac system can do it, smooth muscles can do it, as well as the neurons and some of the neuroendocrine cells in our body. Okay. So, coming back where I was, so our next goal will be to understand this green part, what you see, all these informations, how these informations are being translated into electrical impulse, and that will bring us to the world of ion channels, voltage gated ion channels, ligand gated ion channels, G protein coupled receptors, and a series of proteins which are all sitting out here. Okay. So, with this background, I wish to again remind you people that do not forget that we have started this journey with stretch reflex arc. We will come back to that once I kind of give you an idea how the electrical informations are getting transported. So, then it will be very easy for you people to correlate those circuits, but the reason to introduce you through that circuit is those are very interesting zones where two different systems crosstalk with each other, and understanding those crosstalk, or at least having a philosophical understanding of those kind of crosstalk, are very essential to appreciate the whole system in its complete totality, instead of getting engrossed into one specific aspect of it. Okay. So, I will close in here and thank you.